The United Nations is not the first international endeavor to instigate an organization that regulates and promotes global cooperation and world peace. Indeed, such associations and alliances have existed since the 19th century. Organizations such as the Universal Postal Union and the International Telecommunication Union rose to prominence in the latter half of the 1800s and still exist in some form of capacity today. However, not all these international agreements existed for the enhancement of peaceful operations. In the decade leading up to the First World War, many major superpower alliances, particularly the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente, garnered major international attention through their largely unpredictable actions that contributed to the already insecure atmosphere of global connections. The relationship between the Triple Entente, which was composed of Great Britain, France, and Russia, eventually became exceedingly strained with those of the Triple Alliance, whose members included Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, and in 1914, following the declaration of war on Russia by Germany, the Western world entered into what would become the First World War. The Great War proved to be the most deadly military conflict up until that time, and ended with the collapse of Germany and the Alliance powers in 1918, to which the Entente Alliance imposed upon Germany the Treaty of Versailles, a settlement which recognized Germany as the sole cause of the First World War through numerous penalizing reparations. To help enforce the Treaty of Versailles, and to ensure that another world war would not transpire, the Western Allies unified under the League of Nations in 1919. Brought to fruition by American President Woodrow Wilson, despite the fact that the United States would never formally associate with the organization, the League was to provide a common environment of communication and cooperation, whereby all nations could convey and engage in peaceful discourse. As described by Wilson, the League was a definite guarantee of peace. It is a definite guarantee by word against aggression. It is a definite guarantee against the things which have come near to bringing the whole structure of civilization into ruin. Its purposes do not for a moment lie vague. Its purposes are declared and its powers are unmistakable. It is not in contemplation that this should merely be a league to secure the peace of the world. It is a league which can be used for cooperation in any international matter. Clearly, from the outset, there were extremely high expectations for the League and its agenda, and the League did succeed in a few minor capacities during its lifetime, particularly through its intervention in territorial disputes, such as during the conflict between Germany and Poland regarding Upper Silesia. Yet, in spite of the intense suppositions and early victories, the League ground to a halt in 1939 when the start of the Second World War. The League, despite its passionate intentions, had failed to sustain a peaceful international environment of peace, as the Western world was once again at war. There are several factors which are normally attributed to the shortcoming of the League of Nations, namely those related to the League membership. The League was dominated only by the nations which possessed a wide array of political power, such as Britain, France, Italy, and Japan, thereby rendering obscure nations impotent within the organization. Furthermore, membership within the League was predominantly restricted to European or European-controlled nations, meaning that the voices of citizens from the Arabian and Asian nations were drowned out by elitists. The membership was weakened further by the unhappy association nations who had become dissatisfied with the authority of the League in the midst of the Great Depression. As economic conditions continued to worsen through unmatched fiscal circumstances, many nations disregarded the economic authority of the League so that they could initiate their own economic revitalization. Such was the case with Germany, who, in 1933, following the election of Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany, departed from the association to independently improve their economic prospects. Germany was shortly followed thereafter by Japan and Italy, and, in 1939, the USSR became the only member to be expelled from the League. Nations from across the globe viewed this inability to effectively govern and impose sanction upon its own members as the most crucial foible of the League, and consequently distanced themselves from the League and its activities. In light of the astronomical failure of the League of Nations, given that World War II went on to become the most fatal armed campaign in the history of the Earth, the United Nations was intended to act as a spiritual successor to the League, amending its many deficiencies and averting its focus onto humanitarian efforts. But the United Nations was not to simply act as a political referee. Rather, it was to implement initiatives that would completely revive and sustain its members from all across the globe, and it was here that it made its first major change in the concept of membership. Unlike the League of Nations, the United Nations was an organization that opened up its membership to all of those who expressed a sincere desire to join. Furthermore, while the initial members which made up the United Nations could be described as the victors of the war, the United Nations eventually took considerable measures to eliminate all the jurisdiction that had previously discouraged significant nations from uniting within the alliance. The United Nations was not an organization that would operate through military pressure in order to achieve its goals. Now, granted, the same could have been said of the League of Nations. However, the League evaded this formality through the action of its member states, so that while it would never officially order military action, in contrast, the United Nations was not interested in military presence or power. It was the goal of the United Nations to maintain an international atmosphere of peace and human cooperation, and it was in this endeavor that Canada would play a sizable role. Lester B. Pearson, the Canadian International Affairs Minister and future Prime Minister, had long been an advocate of the United Nations' direct intervention for the express purpose of ending hostility and instilling peace. In 1953, during the events that eventually escalated into the Egyptian Suez Crisis, Pearson urged the UN to assume the responsibility of ending the conflict for the nations which were primarily involved, those being Great Britain, France, and Israel. While some naysayers originally rejected the proposal, the United Nations soon adopted the concept of implementing an emergency international United Nations force to secure and supervise the cessation of hostilities pertaining to the Suez Crisis. The United Nations intervention during the Suez Crisis was the first of what would be thousands of similar peacekeeping missions. Unlike conventional military involvement, peacekeeping soldiers are not authorized to utilize their weapons except in instances of self-defense. As a symbol of their positions as mediators, they wear upon their heads bright blue helmets, so as to create distinction between themselves and conventional soldiers. However, United Nations peacekeeping efforts were not limited to the prevention of violent conflicts, as peacekeepers are readily deployed so as to preserve peace within politically fragile nations. The role of international security was also maintained with the UN through a Greater Security Council composed of 5 permanent members, those being the United States, China, the USSR, which would later become Russia, the United Kingdom, and France, with an additional 10 temporary rotating members. The Security Council was initially created with the insinuating purpose of preventing any form of nuclear attack, and consequently a nuclear war, between the United States and the USSR. Through the communications and relation opportunities provided by the Security Council, the United States and the Soviet Union could engage in peaceful discourse before they acted in such a way that would send the world into a state of nuclear terror. Following the end of the Cold War, the Security Council continued to exist in its operations within the United Nations, albeit focusing its attentions upon smaller and more proportionate threats. Nevertheless, all of this is not to promote the Security Council as a perfect and ultimate authority of international peace. Indeed, the Council itself is riddled with instability and political absurdity, for the Security Council cannot take any action without the unanimous approval from all 5 permanent member nations. Regardless of the fact that the Security Council legislation is binding for all United Nations members, some of the world's most governmentally corrupt nations, particularly Russia and China, can overturn any regulation that they do not find appealing or beneficial. This legislation was by and large introduced to ensure that major member nations remained within the UN, a problem which had previously plagued the United Nations during the 1930s. But how can the United Nations claim to uphold human dignity and value when China, a nation which has repeatedly failed to adhere to the United Nations core philosophies as defined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, possess complete authority to veto any major international security decisions? Furthermore, why should France, a nation of relative obscurity since the Second World War, retain such coveted power when other nations, such as Canada, have heavily contributed to the international developments of the last half-century? It is questions such as these that have brought forth many responses and comments from politicians and commentators from across the globe. In Canada, the popular National Post columnist, Rex Murphy, described the United Nations as an outdated organization that has become irrelevant in the modern world. Said Murphy, "After so many instances of the UN's impotence, corruption, and waste, why does the body still retain any residue of prestige? Is a seat on the Security Council worth the public begging? The UN is a study in moral relativism. It prevents the same countenance to the most despotic regime as it does to a genuine democracy." Murphy goes on to recount how the United Nations has become a safe haven for the men like the President of Iran to degenerate the Western world and all its ideals, due to the fact that the United Nations strives to be accommodating and accepting unto all its member nations. But how can anyone expect to hold the United Nations accountable for these travesties, given that the organization is so largely composed of and influenced by some of the world's most powerful totalitarian states, such as China? And this problem is not unique unto the United Nations. Many of the world's largest and most noteworthy international organizations have done nothing to counteract the conduct of China, and have even gone so far as to grant the nation prestigious honors, such as the right to host the 2008 Olympic Games in Beijing. Nevertheless, China cannot exclusively be considered the darling child of the United Nations. Indeed, in many instances, the United Nations has become a device by which the United States can act and manifest its power. Should any of the permanent members of the Security Council decide against peacekeeping initiatives within a particular region, the United States becomes free to intervene into the conflict as they see fit. In addition to these charges of bias and national partiality, some have questioned whether the United Nations has been successful in its ultimate goal of promoting world peace and prosperity. In the Oxford University Press's very short introduction to the United Nations, author Jesse M. Hanamaki observes that if the purpose of the United Nations was to save mankind from the destruction that have overshadowed the history of the first half of the 20th century, measuring its success depends on one's perspective. On the one hand, it could be argued that since no World War III has erupted, the founders had created a successful organization. On the other hand, not a day has gone by since 1945 without a deathly military conflict somewhere on the globe. Indeed, if war is constantly in a state of existence, can the United Nations claim to have successfully at its objectives? And if the United Nations is failing, what is the cause of this non-fulfillment, and what can be done to rectify the problem? It is clear that if the United Nations is to move past its current state of ineptness, internal structural reform is more than necessary. If the United Nations wants to succeed in its fundamental goals and principles, it must not behave so timidly that it cannot express its resolution against its member states that do not adhere to its directives. But if an environment of equal cooperation is to be fostered, power must be taken away from the most powerful member states and distributed amongst all the nations of the world. Could the United Nations make international advancements when developing nations from Africa share the same amount of power as Germany, Canada, or Japan? Perhaps the solution does not lie within the United Nations itself. As the world moves into the 21st century, Western society has rarely become involved within traditional international warfare. Rather than opposing specific nation-states, Western alliances have now averted their attention to the opposition of terrorist organizations, such as the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, although there have been instances, such as in the recent intervention in Libya, in which Western nations will rally against a specific totalitarian leader or regime. However, it is not by the United Nations that these invasions and interferences have transpired, although, granted, the UN has supported some of these actions. Rather, it has been through the constitution of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that some of the 21st century's most significant anti-warfare and anti-terrorist initiatives have come to pass. Unlike the United Nations, NATO is not bound by any constraints to include unobliging nations within its membership, as NATO's membership is limited only unto the Northern Atlantic nations which promote democracy and peace, including the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, France, and Germany. Nor is this decentralization unique unto the Security Council and peacekeeping initiatives. Economic organizations, such as the Group of 8 and the Group of 20 Nations, have formulated under the world's most significant economies, and have proven to be far more involved in economic governance, specifically through the recent international economic recession, than the United Nations has as of late, as the Economic and Social Council has reverted its attention unto matters of human rights and humanitarian relief efforts. As the significance and benefit of a worldwide organization such as the United Nations passes away, decentralized regional alliances are rising to prominence. Governments from across the globe are consistently taking less of an interest in UN, either through investments in new organizations, such as the G8, the G20, or NATO, or by casually disregarding the decrees of the organization, such as in the case of China. A time of transition has arrived upon international alliance, and in the decades to come, the United Nations must revise its position and purpose if it is to remain of any consequence.